A few weeks ago, I made a 10-minute rant video talking about how I feel like AMG might be going down the drain in certain respects. One of the cars I brought up in that video is this guy right here. This is the new AMG GT63. And it's fair to say that the GT model line is pretty much AMG's only real true purpose-built sports car left. And this new GT has gotten some negative press because it now shares a platform with the 4-seater SL Roadster, which I've also reviewed on this channel. So today is Judgment Day. We're gonna find out if the new GT is ruined by the fact that it's sharing a platform with a 4-seater SL Roadster, because if so, we might be looking at the end times of AMG. Now, if we're gonna give Mercedes credit anywhere, it should definitely be in the design department. Certainly not for their EVs, but all of their ICE and hybrid AMGs look pretty great, and this car is no exception to that. They definitely leaned into the 911 competitor element to this car in the sense that it's a lot more slopey and elegant than the previous generation GT. And if you were to put this in a 911 side by side, a lot of people would argue that they look pretty similar. Now, if I were to nitpick, I must admit I'm not the biggest fan of the rear end lighting design on this car. It feels like they tried to copy the signature 911 unibeam taillight and just did it worse. I feel like it just looks a bit too cartoony and overstated and doesn't match the elegance and simplicity of the front end as much. I'm just not the biggest fan. It feels like it belongs in one of their EVs. You get what I'm saying? But that's pretty much it as far as negatives. Actually, wait, no. I kind of hate these door handles, and not because of the mechanism they use to pop out, and I think the flushed against the body look looks kind of cool. I just hate how inconsistent it is as far as me being able to open the door when the car's unlocked. See, right now the car's unlocked, and you're apparently supposed to just brush the door handles like this for them to open. Of course, now they're working now that I'm filming, but I was filming this thing all day on Sunday and it was just messing up constantly, and it was just so annoying. And it's kind of hard to explain, but I feel like stuff like this, the technology, kind of just brings out the old man in me and makes me just want regular schmegular door handles. You get what I'm saying? Right now it's working, of course. The keys are inside the car, so if they didn't open, then I would be screwed. But yeah, it's happened to me quite a few times when the keys are outside of the car and I'm trying to get inside. I have to do this and then like try to pull on it a bunch of times. It's quite annoying. When thinking about my feelings on this car's design, I honestly had to take the time to realize that I didn't even like the previous Gen GT's design that much. It's not an ugly car, but it just wasn't my cup of tea per se. I feel like the front end was just a little bit too long, pause, and the top of the car felt like a camel's hump, just like super humpy. It was an aggressive looking car, but I feel like it was definitely lacking that elegance and refinement that they've now brought to the table with this new GT. We also have to give Mercedes credit where it's due, because they could have done the simplest thing, which is just taking the SL and putting a hard top roof on it. But despite the fact that this car shares a platform with the SL, it still stands out and looks like its own thing when putting it side by side with the new SL. So credits to Mercedes for doing that, because they definitely could have just done a copy and paste and just put a hard top roof on the SL. But I like that this AMG GT is its own thing design-wise, and it's definitely an improvement over the last gen, if you ask me. So far we're doing pretty good, Mercedes. Now onto the interior. I think there's quite a lot that's great about it, but also some things that don't sit quite right with me. What I do like about this compared to other modern AMGs is that it feels very simple and focused. You've got one screen for your gauge and one screen for your navigation and everything else. And MBUX hasn't given me any trouble so far in terms of glitches or weird bugs that I've experienced in the past. I do wish the steering wheel button system could be a bit more refined and easy to use, because I totally get where they're going with the capacitive D-pad situation, but just like the touchpad that Acura finally stopped using in some of their cars, I just find it to not be intuitive and easy to use a lot of the time. And it just makes me revert to using the touchscreen for controlling media and etc. instead. And there's honestly a handful of buttons on here that I feel like are not necessary and I don't use at all, and I would definitely swap one of these out for like a previous track and next track button. I think that would be absolutely sick, because this D-pad, it's not working for me. But other than that, I like this interior. The seats are comfy and the rear seats have been deleted and can be used as extra storage basically, because you're not going to be able to fit a regular sized human back there. Trust me, I've tried. It was not It was not fun. But when I really look at this interior situation, I feel like there isn't that much that separates it from a well-equipped CLA AMG or an E-Class AMG outside of some carbon fiber bits and whatnot. And keep in mind that this car's over $200,000 as optioned, and it just doesn't feel like a special Mercedes, even though this is supposed to be the flagship car. And I just feel like outside of the ambient lighting and perhaps the size of the main display, there isn't that much that makes this feel any more special than a well-equipped 911 Turbo, which is a car a lot of people are going to cross-shop this AMG GT with. And if this were an $100,000 sports car, I feel like this interior would be pretty much close to perfect, if not perfect. But for double that, I'm feeling a bit whelmed. But practicality-wise, I feel like that's where the GT really shines. The rear hatch is big enough to fit a human inside, not that you need to. And then when you couple that with the storage behind the seats and the door card storage and just how generally spacious the main cabin is, I'd say this is 100% road trip ready for two people. And you could say the very same thing about a 911 to a degree, but because you've got such a wide rear hatch, I'd have to give the GT an edge over the 911. But I know what we really want to know is, how well does this thing drive? Well, let's dive in, shall we? Look, I may not have been the biggest fan of the previous gen AMG GT in certain aspects, but it's an undeniable fact that that car on paper was a more exciting car for someone whose priorities are focused around focused and spirited driving. The older GT was rear-wheel drive as standard across the entire model lineup, all the way up to the Black Series. That car had a trans-axle, which put the transmission in the rear and gave the car a better weight distribution setup. And there was no rear storage area behind you like you've got in this car, which just gave you the feeling that you're in a real purpose-built sports car. And this has pretty much none of that. This car is now all-wheel drive as standard, just like the new SL63. You no longer have the trans-axle setup, putting the transmission in the rear, and now the car is bigger, which makes it better in terms of your ability to store things, but it's definitely a downgrade in terms of weight savings and the overall size and footprint of the car on the road. And so on paper, all of these things sound like a pretty big downgrade, but I feel like if you tailor your expectations just a little bit differently as far as what this car is meant to do and meant to be, you might be a bit surprised by how well this thing drives. I certainly am. Mercedes is doing something that almost everyone in the sports car world is doing right now, which is supplementing everything with tech. This car is about 550 pounds heavier than the entry-level AMG GT from 5 years ago, but it's using very advanced suspension tech to numb out all of that extra weight you're lugging around. And so, despite this two-door coupe weighing about 500 pounds more than the Carrera 4 GTS, it handles pretty freaking well. When you take this thing around a bend, you can feel that the weight is there, but you don't feel encumbered by it. This car does what it needs to do. And so, just like a lot of high-tech modern sports cars, it's simply not possible to extract the full extent of what this thing's capable of on a public road. I've been in some all-wheel drive cars that still have that tail-happy and playful element to them. Some cars that come to mind are the Jaguar F-Type R, the BMW M4 X-Drive, the Maserati Gran Turismo. Those are all cars that still have that slide ability, if that makes any sense. This car just really doesn't have that. It's almost impossible to get the back end out unless you really fiddle around with the traction control settings, just turn it off completely or put it in drift mode or something crazy like that. And I'm sure one of the reasons for that is the tire profile. So the rear tires are similar to what you get on the base previous gen GT, which is 305s, but the fronts are now running 295s, which is wider than what you got on the AMG GT Black Series, which is the most track-capable AMG and pretty much the most track-capable Mercedes outside of an F1 car ever made. And so you've got a setup that's almost as close to being square as you could get on a car like this. And yeah, it's impossible to slide. It's like you're driving a sled to an extent. You can look at this in two different ways. You can firstly think of it as a positive in terms of you feeling like it's impossible to screw up in this car and being super confident and having a super confidence-inspiring driving experience. But it could also be seen as a negative because some people aren't looking for the most precision and perfection-focused sports car. And I feel like the 911 Turbo is right in the middle in terms of it offering just a little bit more edge and kind of like hairiness to the driving experience if you really get on it. This car just quite honestly doesn't have that. It just feels like you could never screw up in this car. Another area where this car lacks just a little bit for me, and I know some people are gonna say I sound crazy for saying this, but it doesn't feel insanely fast. And I feel like that's just a sign of the time we're in right now. A car I reviewed a few months ago was the Corvette E-Ray, and for tens of thousands of dollars less, that car would absolutely smoke this thing in pretty much every measurable way. This car shares the exact same powertrain setup as the SL63, so the top trim GT63, which is what I'm in right now, has a 577 horsepower twin turbo V8 with 590 pound-feet of torque, and it's using a 9-speed multi-clutch gearbox. Generally speaking, it's not slow at all. Definitely not. That's not what I'm trying to get at here. But I feel like for the money, $205,000 as tested, if you really want like a solid spec for one of these, you're going to be spending 200 grand US pretty much no matter what. And so for that amount of money, it doesn't feel insanely fast. If I spent 200 grand on this and have had experienced other cars in this price range and performance segment, I would feel just a little bit disappointed. There's definitely some turbo lag as far as it getting off the line with a lot of urgency, unless you're doing a straight up launch control. And I just think about most of the 911s I've driven, especially the 992s, the 4Ss, the GTSs, the turbos. They all just feel quicker than this car. The closest competitor to this car is the non-S 911 turbo. So the turbo model right before the flagship Turbo S 911. And they basically have the same power figures, more or less. And that car would absolutely smoke the GT63 in a straight line, on a rolling race, pretty much any scenario on a track. It just doesn't compare. And so, like I said, this car is not slow. It does 0 to 60 in the low threes, I think a 3.1, 3.0. I know someone has done a 2.9 in this car, which is pretty good. But given how quick of a car you can get for 200 grand nowadays, it just feels a little lackluster. Now, these aren't the greatest conditions, but I figured we can do a launch control. So foot on the brake. Whew. Let's see our time. 3.09. Okay, that's pretty good. Now, one area where the GT63 absolutely stomps on the 911 Turbo and Turbo S is in the sound department. At the end of the day, this still has a 4-liter turbocharged V8. And so while it isn't as brutal and intense as AMGs of old, and some of the sound experience you're getting is actually being pumped in through the speakers, which definitely sucks. I'm not a big fan of that. It still has a heck of a lot more character than the absolute vacuum cleaner that is the 911 Turbo's exhaust note. You're getting nice little whip cracks on the downshifts. You're getting nice little burbles on the overrun. It definitely is a lot more fun of a car in the sound and audible department. If I bought this car, I would still feel like an aftermarket exhaust, nothing like a straight pipe setup. I feel like an aftermarket exhaust though would be, you know, that would be something I'd have to do to this car just to get it 100% where I want it to be. But overall, it's still a lot more exciting than what you get out of a 911 Turbo. At the end of the day, this is still a GT car, and so how well does it do the actual grand touring stuff? Well, it's not the smoothest ride I've ever been in. I feel like a BMW M8 or a Maserati Gran Turismo might be a bit more multifaceted in terms of how comfortable it is in the regular comfort modes, but I feel like I could do 1,000 miles in this car and not even flinch. The ride is a little bit intense in sport and race mode, but when you're just cruising around in comfort mode, I feel like it's a pretty solid ride. This isn't the best example of Mercedes suspension in an AMG car for sure, but it's also supposed to be their flagship and most sport-focused model. So at the end of the day, if you want a super comfortable cruiser, you're gonna have to compromise on the sportiness. And if you want something super sporty, you're gonna have to compromise on the comfort. I feel like this car isn't quite perfect at meeting in the middle, but it's good enough for me. I feel like if you find the bucket seats in this car to be comfortable enough for you, I feel like that's really all you need in terms of making sure you're comfortable in this car. I think it's safe to say that the GT63 is like a lot of new modern sports cars coming out today. It's definitely lacking the scariness and edginess of the model it's replacing, but also simultaneously becoming a lot more multifaceted and technically superior in ways that's kind of hard to describe. There's a lot of tech going on under the hood here. And I have no doubt that this new GT63 absolutely whoops the previous gen model in every measurable way, the track, straight line, etc. But I feel like in a lot of ways, this car won't be nearly as fun to drive. You're gonna cross-shop this car with the 911 Turbo, which doesn't sound nearly as good and doesn't draw as much attention aesthetically as the GT does. But I feel like the Turbo still has a bit more analog driving character and edginess to it. You could also compare this car to the BMW M8 and Maserati Gran Turismo Trofeo. Both of those cars have a very similar weight to this and almost a similar price point depending on which one you're talking about. I think this car has better public street cred than both of those cars, but also just not quite as fun in certain situations. To answer the question proposed at the beginning of this video, does AMG still have a fighting chance? Does this car signal the end of the AMG we know and love? And I don't think it does. I feel like this car isn't perfect. Not that any AMG they've made has been necessarily perfect, but I feel like there's no reason why we couldn't get a rear-wheel drive version of the GT63, even if it has just like a little less power, like 20 less horsepower or something like that, kind of similar to how they do the R8 V10 all-wheel drive and rear-wheel drive models. If they could give us something like that that's just a bit more edgy, driver-focused like the previous generation, I feel like that would put AMG in the right spot and bring a lot of faith back into the customer base. Because man, if you look at the comment section of a lot of like Instagram posts on the AMG Instagram page, it doesn't look very good right now. But this is not a bad car at all. There's a lot of great things about this car, and you know, I do think this car is probably going to depreciate a lot heavier than a 911 Turbo. So in a year from now, this might be like 160, 170, and for that amount of money, it's actually a pretty good idea. But as far as that rear-wheel drive model and where the model lineup goes from here, because there was like 7 or 8 different GT models of the last gen, this is just the first one. Well, we have the 55 and the 63, but these are the 2 entry-level models and it can only go up from here. So we're gonna assume that it's only gonna get better from here, but we'll see. But that's about it for this one. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for future content like this. And if you want to support the channel, we have merch. This is just one of a few designs we have on the website, carswithmiles.com. And yeah, we've got some exciting stuff coming in the next month or so. I can't really talk about some of that stuff, but it'll be pretty cool. Alrighty, talk to you guys in the next one. And the only car that costs more is the Turbo S, the Big Daddy, right? Wow, I just said Big Daddy. That was super weird.